pop4conservation.com. Ladies and gentlemen, that's where you want to go to support Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation fundraising efforts. Pop4conservation.com is where you can go to be a big winner. 80 winners, over $200,000 in prizes, vehicles, firearms, hunting and fishing packages. Again, 80 winners, over $200K in prizes. Pop4conservation.com, protecting our pursuits. Pop4conservation.com. Go there today to enter.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Welcome to Salmon Wars, the podcast where we dive deep into the challenges facing the iconic salmon of the Pacific Northwest. I'm your host, Cody McLaughlin, a passionate salmon fisherman in the last frontier of Alaska. Join me as I interview a wide range of experts, including biologists, commercial and recreational fishermen, advocates, native people, politicians, and other stakeholders. Together, we'll explore the driving forces behind the dramatic decline in salmon returns and seek solutions to save these vital fish populations before it's too late. This limited-run investigative series will take you on a journey through the complex world of salmon conservation and management. Subscribe now to join the fight to protect our salmon and preserve the rich ecosystems they support. Together, we can make a difference in the future of these magnificent fish. Welcome to Salmon Wars. All right, welcome back to the Salmon Wars Show. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for everybody who has commented, who's shared, everything of that nature. Just before we get started, I am getting over a quick cold, so everybody will have to forgive me, but this was too important of a conversation for me to pass up the opportunity. We have today Eva Burke, our newest guest. As I said, I've been trying to get as many different perspectives from different walks of life and stakeholders with regard to salmon as I could. Eva, she's a woman with many hats. She's in the advocacy space. She's in the consulting space. She's an advisory board member at Native Movement. She's an owner of a small business of Rock Crossing Consulting. And she's also a graduate student at the University of Fairbanks. She also currently serves as the first tribal seat on the advisory panel to the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. And she works as a consultant to the Yukon River Intertribal Fish Commission. So somebody who's deeply immersed in the issue that we're here to talk about, which is salmon and how that affects the cultures and the peoples of not just Alaska, but the entire Pacific Northwest. Eva, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for having me. And also, I didn't think this was in the introduction, but I grew up commercial fishing and subsistence fishing along the Tanana River, which is a major drainage into the Yukon River. And I've recently returned back to subsistence fishing on both Yukon and Tanana Rivers since 2018. And just when we get back, we've been hit with this crash. It's really shut us down and is really, a detriment to some of us who are trying to reclaim that way of life and get back to subsistence fishing on the river, or else the people that have been doing it for so long and are feeling real lost without it right now.
So you mentioned this actually when we got connected, and thanks again to the Stop Alaska Trawler Bycatch Facebook group that everybody has been tremendously supportive in that group. You mentioned that you've actually been shut down for 5 years from salmon fishing?
Yes. We were, it happened in 2020. In 2019 is the year that we started seeing different salmon floating up dead from the heat stress. And then, they kept allowing fishing, and some of us think we might have fished too much in 2019. And then in 2020, and that's because we were waiting for the chum to come in. And and they weren't coming in, so we kept fishing. And then in 2020 is when we had built a wheel. We hadn't fished at our camp in quite a while, and we put the wheel in, and we noticed right away that something was off, that there wasn't any fish in the water. And I wasn't at that time, we didn't have Starlink at camp, so I didn't know that there was a shutdown until I went back into town and was able to see the announcement that there was emergency fishing closures. And ever since then, I've been advocating really hard to, one, listen a lot to understand what's happening with salmon and listen at a well-rounded perspective, going to every single meeting that has to deal with the Yukon River salmon crisis, and trying to weave together the different spaces, because there's state management, there's federal management, and none of these spaces seem to be working together very well right now.
Mm. So, Eva, as I understand it, you just had a birthday as well. Is that right?
I sure did. I'm 42 years old now, and I think it's kind of funny because this summer I got a compliment that I was born to be in a smokehouse, and and it's like, because we've been cutting reds through this whole crisis, and it's an honor because I've been working hard since I was about 35 to become a smokehouse master. And so I feel like I've achieved that this summer. My biggest achievement.
Didn't you so we've been trying to get on the phone for a couple weeks here, and didn't you say last week you were doing a demonstration somewhere?
Yes, I do them at different places because a lot of people actually, if you can imagine, we're not living on the Yukon like we used to. A lot of us are in the city now. Myself, I didn't start cutting fish until I was 35.
Wow.
So I did one over at Canada Chiefs Conference. They had a food security summit here in town. And then we had one down in Nenana in July this past summer for the Intertribal Agriculture Council.
Interesting. Okay. And you know what? That's a really good point that you bring up. And, you're moving us right along here. Being in Fairbanks, which many people, even, what Alaskans call kind of outside, right? They view as interior Alaska. To those people, to a national audience that, maybe doesn't understand the intricacies of how Alaska works, and talk to us a little bit about why somebody who, quote unquote, lives in interior Alaska is here to talk about what a lot of people probably view as a coastal issue.
Oh, absolutely. And it's really interesting that, you think about it like that, because our salmon migrate. They're over a 2,000-mile migration journey. And I'm in like the mid-river area of the Yukon, with the headwaters being, First Nation territories up in Canada. And so, in other areas of the United States, the salmon are managed by the Fed. They're managed by the Pacific Fishery Management Council. The tribes actually have a seat at that table, and they have a treaty right to the salmon. And we're set up differently in Alaska, where we have state management of salmon in the in-river area, like where I'm at, and then also within 3 miles of the coast. So, there's other areas of the state that intercept some of our coastal Western Alaska salmon. They might be migrating down in the Gulf of Alaska and the Aleutian Islands area. And so that's where we run into the bycatch issue, is because they're out there milling around for a majority of their life. And then also they're milling, but they're also migrating home. They're migrating home depending on what age they are.
Over thousands of miles.
Thousands of miles. And it's really crazy how bycatch is managed, because they used to manage Chinook and Chum bycatch together, which to me makes more sense, because the Chinook and Chum, summer chum, they run together into the Yukon. And I've got stories and photos of my grandparents catching king salmon all the way into October. So in my mind, there was a lot more pulses of king salmon. And I was just looking up data today, and it's crazy because the 2000 to 2019, average Chinook run on the Yukon has been about 175,000. And if you go back into like a State of Alaska Yukon River comprehensive plan, they were taken out up to 150,000 Chinook for commercial fisheries in the 60s to the early 90s. So as much fish we're running now is what they actually used to take out for commercial, plus subsistence, plus, there's escapement on top of that. And I think we've really, really over-harvested the Yukon for a long time now. And it's both a state issue, but it's also when the abundance is low, we need to press on all levers out in the ocean, which means if we can't harvest a single Chinook, then we need people to be limiting their bycatch, limiting their intercept.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's crazy to me, and I think you might not even be the first person who said that on this show. Is that it's crazy to think about 17,000 fish being tossed overboard as garbage, but you can't catch one for dinner. You can't even catch one for dinner on the Yukon for several years now. I mean, yeah, I think you said 5 years now that you've been unable to fish. And that's, again, another thing I'd like to try to get across to the audience. And that a lot of the people that are audience here are like, we get a lot of listenership in Missouri, Florida, like other parts of the country who maybe don't understand what we mean by subsistence, right? This is a long-standing, thousands of years way of life in the Yukon River Delta. And there's not like a Costco right down the road type of situation, So briefly talk to us about that, like what the difference is, because I know there's legal terms and stuff involved in the word subsistence that a lot of people maybe don't understand. So help us understand that.
Yes, in Alaska, subsistence is basically fishing to feed your household. And there's differences in the state and federal view of subsistence. Like federally qualified subsistence users, they need to reside in a rural area. Whereas, the state, any resident of Alaska is entitled to subsistence rights. In any part of Alaska, you can travel to different places. It's not just about, fishing in the area that you grew up in. And so, the transportation, like you were mentioning, these places, like even Rampart, Alaska, which is where I go with my family, it's about, and to get there on the boat, it's a 3-hour truck drive. Then it's another couple hours on the boat downriver. And then you can take a small plane there. You're limited to 40 pounds of freight. A lot of times the planes can't get in and out, or we're seeing a reduction in our plane service, and so you can't always get stuff on it, and it's expensive. It's expensive to ship the farther you go out, and then in the winter, we can only get there on ice roads. So there's a period of time, a lot of times, where you can only get to many of our places by plane, and the weather prohibits that from happening. And also, like during COVID, we just saw people in our villages were at the end of the line, and they don't have grocery stores. Rampart does not have a grocery store. You have to haul everything in there. So people's diet is probably 75% subsistence, and the rest of it, is real basic items. Like we all have canned milk or powdered milk, noodles, rice, beans, some spices, salt, a little bit of sugar, tea, like coffee, very limited stuff. And that's also why, like, if you can imagine, like, people not having access to those foods, it's not just about the salmon right now. So salmon is a huge part of what we put up for the winter, but we're seeing more predators preying on things like moose. And that's another one of our major parts of our diet. And if you're paying attention to Alaska, we're losing huge amounts of our caribou herds right now. That's another huge part of our diet in this Yukon River drainage. So we're facing like an ecosystem-wide crisis here, and that's why a lot of people say in understanding that salmon is a keystone species, and when king salmon are failing, other species of salmon are behind them, and other parts of the ecosystem are behind them too.
This is a question that I tend to ask all of the guests, and it's a little bit of a loaded question, but I think you've already answered it. But I'd like to, just hear your kind of affirmative versus kind of extrapolating what you're saying, right? Would you say that Alaska has a salmon problem?
It's terrible right now. I don't think so. I tell people, I said, there isn't a river in Alaska that has a healthy king salmon run. And we've been seeing the chum runs are declining now. Sockeye seems to be a stronghold in Bristol Bay.
Mhm.
Copper River and Kenai are okay, but they've recently had some issues,
Mhm.
Pink salmon, that's largely pink and chum are a big part of what we see in Alaska as far as harvest, and what's out there is hatchery from our own hatchery fish. And this year we're seeing um, low pinks, low silvers in the Prince William Sound, the Gulf of Alaska areas. So Cook Inlet areas. So it makes you wonder, like, what's really going on with the salmon? Um, have we tried to correct ourselves with hatcheries and created more issues, and we don't really fully understand the food web in the ocean? I mean, that's a given, and climate change is really affecting that food web on top of like us meddling with it.
Mhm. As a former research assistant, current graduate student, as somebody who's in the thick of it, right? So, like, you're on the advisory council for the NPFMC, you're a consultant with the Kuskokwim, or I'm sorry, the Yukon River Intertribal Fish Commission.
Mhm.
Help us understand what you see as the driving factors, because I've had a number of guests on, and we've heard everything from overharvest on commercial, overharvest on sport fishing, overharvest on the subsistence side. We've heard that climate change is the big factor here. We've heard that bycatch is the big factor. We've heard that bycatch is the big human factor, and that all of this stuff has an impact in the long run. How do you view the issue?
Yeah, I mean, I would sum it up as mismanagement, and I
Mm.
really think that commercial fishing and wherever commercial fishing has and there is currently being done, like my family, we firsthand saw the loss of commercial fishing on the Yukon River and the devastation that it caused a lot of our communities and the out migration. That's why I grew up on a trap line and that fish camp, and all of the resources we brought into our home was either fish that we caught and sold, or else fur that we trapped and sold as well. And then those resources all started to decline shortly after statehood, and this influx of like too much pressure on the systems. And also, the Arctic is a harsh environment.
Mm.
It has a lower productivity. And so I think we put too much pressure on this environment. And you can even see, like, for a river as big as the Yukon, it has a much lower productivity than warmer places that have king salmon, that have like a shorter river with better habitat for spawning per mile. Uh, so we're already challenged up here. And I think that if you look at uh, kind of the data and all the different stories that I feel that researchers and managers try to tell themselves, I think climate change sounds good right now, but it wasn't that long ago where at I work in agriculture too. We were at USDA, United States Department of Agriculture meetings where they weren't even allowed to use the word climate change.
Mm.
So we weren't allowed to say, "Hey, this is due to climate change." And on the Yukon, my family got pushed out of commercial fishing in the late 80s, early 90s is when we started to see a lot of decline. And the river has never recovered to that abundance ever. And we see ourselves, as I'm saying, we're looking at an average of 175,000 kings as normal. And that's what they actually used to take out of the Yukon prior to 2000 commercially, right? So it's not normal what we think abundance is. So I
Right.
think that's a huge problem is Western science is lacking. We need to
Yeah.
have some traditional indigenous knowledge within that science. And I think um, we had a lot better approach to this when the Yukon did have commercial value still. It seemed like people still were trying to protect it and care for it. And what I feel like I've seen is, a shift away from that because it's not producing money. And so people aren't trying to protect it as much. And I mean that as like the state is doing their job as the people that are tasked with fisheries management.
Yeah.
And then the state is that it's hard. I always say mismanagement because they're the same group and entity that's tasked with hatcheries and determining what's safe for the wild salmon stocks. And
Right.
so that's what we're fighting for in some of these regulations is you're not even following your own policy, state of Alaska. Subsistence is first. What's your sustainable salmon policy? To protect wild stocks, like you got to follow your own regulations and statutes, and they're not doing that right now. And like I said, I think a lot of it has to do with the loss of revenue that drives people to protect fisheries. And then when it comes to hatcheries, what we saw in the Yukon was a huge change in the size and shape of the king salmon and
Yeah.
of every species, not just the king salmon. And that to us indicated that something was going on in the ocean with the food web and the change in the salmon's diet. And there's a lot of data now that correlates the decline in the size with the increase in hatchery output.
Yeah. Well, John Warrenchuk from episode 1, he was a biologist from Oceania that joined to talk. He talked a little bit about the change in the diet of king salmon, and he also mentioned that one of the weird things that they had seen through their studies is just the increase in pollock offal and stuff that king salmon are eating. They're like following along behind these boats and eating the discarded remains of pollock, and that's a major change from the stuff that they're normally eating, which when you couple that with major changes to the ocean ecosystem and stuff, I think begins to paint a picture, if you will, about how human impact is changing even down the line, as you say, the size and shape of the salmon that are making it back into the rivers.
Okay.
Now, so I want to go back a little bit. You talked a little bit about some mismanagement and stuff like that. So let's get into specifics. What do you, not just as a consultant, as an expert on the issue, right? We'll get to that stuff in a moment here, and maybe this will color what you have to say anyway. What do you see as the big priorities that are being missed by the state of Alaska, by the feds in the NPFMC? Do you see one group as more responsible than less, or talk to us a little bit about how you see that from where you sit?
Oh, yeah, this is that's why I was bringing up earlier about the federal government manages salmon in other parts of the country. The North Pacific doesn't make a single decision without the consent of the state of Alaska Department of Fish and Game. They are at those meetings and they are having a lot of input in meetings with the pollock industry about the alternatives and the changes in their behavior that need to be seen, the reduction in bycatch that needs to happen. So I think that the state of Alaska, even though the North Pacific, and they have, state of Alaska determines the voting seats, right? They're the one.
Yeah, we have the lion's share of the appointees.
Yeah, so they're the ones. The state of Alaska, it has a lot of influence. What happening when it comes to any fisheries that are happening in Alaska, whether it be in state or federal waters managed by either entity. So I just like want to make that really clear that, and I think it leaves a lot of room for the blame game, right? And that's why it'd be nice if one entity was managing salmon and that they were really truly looking at a gravel to gravel approach. Like, you can't have a healthy wild food source unless you have a healthy ecosystem. And what you're mentioning about the salmon eating on the dead pollock discards, and that's why we think we're seeing an increase in ichnophronus. But also the chum and chinook were both feeding on the age 0 pollock. So at one point, the state and the feds had a meeting back in the 90s, I think 94, a joint Board of Fish, North Pacific Fishery Management Council meeting to go over the Chinook and Chum savings area. And so they had these areas north of Unimak that were protected. And similarly at the Board of Fish, the June Area M had some restrictions in 2001 to 2003. They knew this whole area was a key migration corridor, milling feeding area for both Chinook and Chum. And so they put these things into place before, and first through their magic, in my mind, we saw an increase in salmon, but the pollock was not doing well. And what they did was, there's an area, like if you look at their catch per unit effort maps, everything happens in that area north of Unimak. Highest catch per unit effort, highest Chinook bycatch, highest Chum bycatch. And it's because there's a relationship there between the Chinook and pollock and Chum and pollock. And they should have left that area alone. And when we saw an abundance in salmon increase, they started saying, hey, we're having higher bycatch rate. And instead of looking at an abundance-based cap at that time, they just opened up these areas and started doing this rolling hotspot business. And then the rolling hotspot business, they got to go back into those areas and fish past the cap or whatever. And in 2006, 2007, they had incredibly high amounts of Chum and Chinook bycatch, which I don't think we've ever fully recovered from. They took more Chinook in 1 year than we take in 1 year for subsistence on the Yukon in that 1 year of bycatch. So, and it's interesting enough is like they opened up that area to get more pollock, and they got rid of a whole bunch of salmon that actually feed on pollock, which would help the pollock populations rebound, which they did, because right when we went into our first moratorium in 2014, 2015 on the Yukon, a self-imposed moratorium, we were seeing low numbers again. One king salmon life cycle after that huge bycatch rate. And you can't just be like 1 + 1 = 2 in this business, right? But you can say that had an impact. That's a significant event in my mind. And they just never went back to these savings area, and we finally got the abundance-based cap for Chinook, but it's kind of too late. It came at a time when Chinook's already going down, and right now they'll say, oh, the fish are all hatchery fish. It's like, yeah, you're taking genetics when salmon stocks are depressed, so you don't have an accurate picture of what's supposed to be there, what's actually there.
Yeah, you're taking your samples in the lean times instead of when there's any sort of abundance, which is what you're aiming at. I do want to touch on this hatchery issue because I think it's something that, like, so a lot of people, if you Google salmon, anadromous fish, any of that stuff, you read any of the books about anadromous fish that I've got here on my desk here. I'm a huge fan of anadromous fish. That's why I'm doing this podcast. But I think there's a sense And I think it is true in other states that hatcheries are like the big thing, the big beast, if you will. And around the world, that's an issue for sure. It's probably the number one issue. It may not be the number one issue here in Alaska, but I also don't want people to walk away from this show thinking that it's unimportant, right? So talk to us a little bit about how you see that issue, how you see it affecting Alaska. I know that the biomass that we see from pumping pinks into the system is getting a lot of airtime right now in the news. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, the pinks, they're just voracious eaters, and they can come back quickly, and they make a good production hatchery species. Chum, it's a good production hatchery species. It's not quite the voracious eater as pink though. And the studies, that's the other thing too, is like a lot of the studies are focusing the effects of pink on sockeye. And so we don't really have a whole data picture, but that's where I think you have to kind of use what local fishermen are observing, which is that different size and shape of fish that we have seen in the 80s and 90s. And very distinctly, you can see the drop in body weight in the different data that exists. Like, it's just crazy how much poundage. I mean, the Chinooks, I think they're less than half their size that they used to be. And I don't know what other people want to feel like. Pointing to climate change after 2000 might make some sense, but we were here before, right? We were here before. We bounced out of it, but climate change is making it a lot harder to bounce out of it. So I think gives us a real opportunity to look at the hatchery. And I think a lot of people want to use data all the time and not understanding that the data sets are so expensive and take so long to collect that really you have to like use what you have now and make some decisions. And when you put so many fish out there, the commissioner said himself, you got to put 1.8 billion fish out to get, I can't remember the amount back, but it's less than 1 million. So where are all those other fish going? And how much food that all those billions of fish are taking away from other species of fish. And every single wild salmon species in Alaska is declining. And I think that's what I'm looking for now, is to understand better, like this pink salmon, this low pink salmon harvest that just happened in the Gulf of Alaska. What was it, hatchery pinks that didn't come back? Like, what exactly happened? I don't know yet. I haven't had time to look into it, but it's just an indication of like the system is under so much pressure that eventually it's going to the bottom is going to fall out from underneath of it.
Yeah, it's a shame to think about, because it's kind of a catch-22 in that many people see hatchery fish as just fish, right? And I think a lot of other media has done a good job of illustrating the differences between those things and how hatchery genetics are not what many wild anadromous runs need, and that they've evolved over millions of years to fight and survive in the wild, and that the selection process for a hatchery fish is different than what Mother Nature would prioritize, right? But setting aside that stuff, what I'm hearing is that, as you see it, hatcheries, bycatch, mismanagement, like too many cooks in the kitchen, if you will, is what I'm understanding is contributing here. Let's talk a little bit about the impact, because that's, the main story that I was trying to tell when I started this podcast. I wanted to get into two things, which is really dialing down for people who are getting lots of spin and PR and all this stuff from different industries and from different stakeholders, and everybody's got a dog in the fight, if you will. So I was looking to really distill that down and like give people a resource to get educated about the issue, but also to help people understand the individual impacts and the cultural impacts of how cratering salmon runs across the state. Like you said, I mean, it really struck me that you said that there's not a river in Alaska right now that's got a strong salmon run, right? That is a powerful statement, but in a state like Alaska, that's, I mean, I don't want to say whole identity, but a big part of your, you said it yourself, it's a keystone species, big part of the identity of the state, not just visually, but not just iconically, not just in the iconography, but the trees along the riverbanks feed on the salmon, the eagles do, even the trout do. If you're a fly fisherman and you don't like to fish for salmon and you like to fly up here to fish for big rainbow trout in a float plane, if they're not feeding on eggs, salmon eggs and salmon flesh for 6 or 8 months of the year underneath the ice, there's not going to be 30-inch trout in Alaska anymore, So, like, how do you see the impacts just, if you could put on your researcher hat for a moment and, your experience working with the tribal councils and stuff, like, how do you see the cultural impact? Has it had a net negative effect? Have communities been really resilient to it? How do you see the effects there?
Oh, I think it really varies from community to community and really from family to family. Like my family, we didn't subsistence fish for a long time because my dad was having to work construction. So that really took away because he's the one that takes us out to fish, right? We didn't have a grandpa or uncles that could carry on that tradition. And then the economy, that a little economy that we had of fur and fish. Like I grew up, I thought I had everything in the world because we had what we needed, and we didn't take a lot. But when we lost those economies, it radically changed a lot of rural communities in Alaska. I think I saw a statistic somewhere like 87% of our rural villages in Alaska are having to move into Fairbanks to go to work, to go to school, higher education. That's where everything is at. Everything is cheaper. And what you're seeing then is a lot of people like myself, 35 years old, and just learning how to cut fish. And that's a long-term impact of the salmon crisis. Like, because when it hits commercially, eventually, it's going to catch up to subsistence if you don't change the way you manage. And we shifted off commercially fishing on kings. That was all the way up until like 2008. We were commercially fishing on kings on the Yukon. And then we shifted on to chum. We started relying on chum too heavily. And then that also crashed. So what you're seeing now is like when I started going back to the Yukon in 2018, my river, the Tanana River, was already pretty quiet. There was a few nets out there, but there was still a lot of life on the Yukon, it seemed like, 2018, 2019, 2020. I go out there every single year, and it keeps changing to less and less boat, less and less people making that trip out. People talking and really grieving a lot of like loss and pain, because even if we live in Fairbanks, a lot of us fly home, take the boat home, get home to our Yukon River villages to fish with our family and put up salmon. So there's a huge just loss of connection and family and sharing. But also like king salmon are meant for us who live in the interior, who spend a lot of time outdoors. I don't know if you ever been out here in this 50 below weather, but like if you eat store food like pork, chicken, beef, you're gonna get gassed out if, like, say we're setting traps all day and we're out in the cold all day doing stuff. And that's why we need our dry fish, the king salmon with the oil, the jarred fish, the dry meat, those muktuk seal oil. Those foods all have a lot of like gas, like it's the high quality gas that gets you through all the ways of living out here in this harsh environment. And so not having that, we're seeing huge changes in diabetes and heart disease, obesity. at TCC, Tanana Chiefs Conference said they had a 70% increase in pre-diabetes in their region, 42 villages in the Yukon, in this short 5 years of the crash, because that's how much we rely on that food source, and having to switch off of it to more affordable options might not be the best ones for our bodies. And our bodies are having to rapidly adjust to this change in diet. But there's also a lot of, I would say, adaptation too and resilience, whereas people are like, okay, we're going to stand down off this fish, but what else can we do? And maybe that's relying more heavily on beaver and cleaning up some beaver dams and kind of cleaning up some of that spawning habitat that the beaver may have impacted. A little more whitefish, a little more migratory birds. So we're starting to do agriculture. We're flying in. We're like, what Salmon Run's doing? Okay, Bristol Bay. All right, let's set up some networks with our friends and family out there so that we can bring Bristol Bay sockeye to our fish camps, to our smokehouses, so that we're still touching fish and having relationship. Okay, we're not fishing. Let's send some of our people out to fish in Bristol Bay. Like, we're trying to adapt and navigate and still maintain. And I think that, I'm a tribal member and I'm Alaska Native. And I think we're some of the most resilient people in the world, and adapting is like, that's our specialty. I mean, to be honest, but it's also a time of great loss, but also like I have great hope too.
Well, it's good to hear that you have hope. And I mean, just hearing you talk, it's not just about the fish. I mean, that's a big part of it. But as with anything that becomes an event that brings people together, when that goes away, it has to affect the ties that bind, if you will. And it's good to hear that there's adaptations and stuff being made to help kind of mitigate that. But to me, it sounds like, we maybe even haven't heard the last of what the long-term effects are. You yourself, I think you said you started really cutting fish at 35. I shudder to think what that looks like for 2-3 generations down the line, right? That's the thing that I think needs to get fixed now, because as you say, king salmon life cycle 7 years, right? So we're only a couple of life cycles away from that. And the slower this gets fixed, if at all, it reminds me of the Atlantic salmon on the East Coast. And I've made that analogy before on the show that, nobody wants to be the last person to catch one before it's an endangered species, which is seemingly right around the corner. And that's what I'm trying to get across to people all around the country, is that Alaska seems very far away and it's a little bit of a niche issue, but it is still tremendously important to all types of different walks of life that live here. The native communities like yours, the people that live in Anchorage, from, Anchorage all the way to Fairbanks and beyond, right? It's important to everybody that lives here. So as far as supporting issues, like how to get involved, like how can people learn more about this issue? Is there a resource? Is there, you're involved with some intertribal fish commissions and stuff. Do they put out white papers, things of that nature that people can learn about?
Yeah, that's actually what we're working on right now. I'm actually putting together a salmon situation report.
Oh, cool.
And really taking the time to go back in history and put together multiple timelines of actions that have happened, and pair that with some data that we have to look at what's been our impact and what do we consider abundance. And also, like, if people want to get involved, like Tanana Chiefs Conference also has a tribal resource stewardship program. We're putting together some different websites to share out information. So the Fish Commission will be creating that in the future, having kind of like here, because you go to all these different meetings and you hear everybody else's story and data, but it's like, no, actually, let's tell our story. And then here's some data to support what our story is. And we're the people who live there. We've been living it firsthand, like there's no closer understanding of it. Like, the people closest to the problem are the people closest to the solution, in my mind.
Right.
And that's why I worry, because the state of Alaska, it's like the same people that got us into this mess, are they the same people that are going to get us out? It's going to take a new approach some very different thinking, including multiple knowledge systems. And I encourage folks like to just know, like, if you're in the United States, learn more about what you're eating and where your seafood is sourced from. Like, learn more about this is the last wild salmon run in the world. This is it right here. Can we do better as humans? Can we actually do better as humans to maybe protect and learn from our past mistakes and change our behavior? And that means like acknowledging the mistake, and that's what we need to do. Don't eat fish fillets, please. Don't eat fish fillets. Like imitation crab. Like, stop eating California rolls. I'm sorry, it's bad for you. It's bad for us. And I know that might be a cultural preference in some places, but it's actually harming our communities right now. When if you have a market demand for things and it continues to grow, then how can you just slow down that demand, right? Slow the demand, slow the supply. Like we need to do that. And if you're in Alaska, like show up to our meetings, come to the Board of Fish meetings, come to the North Pacific Fishery Management Council meetings. There's meeting outlooks on the Board of Fish, meeting outlooks on North Pacific website. Fish Commission plans to have a calendar to share out and join us. And also, like, you can write letters. You can write letters to the Secretary of Commerce, who essentially, like, has a very big role in a lot of how federal fisheries are managed. Write letters to your governors, write letters to the legislature in Alaska. People need to know this stuff. I mean, we're trying to push on all fronts and educate as much as possible.
You gave me chills just now because you said something that I think I've said almost word for word on on episodes of this podcast before, which is that Alaska really is the last truly wild run of salmon. And that's why, I think this project was important for me. And just to do is kind of my ode to type of fish that I love. I've always been in love with the naturalist fish. I've always had tremendous respect for salmon, and I would hate to see what happened to East Coast Atlantic salmon happen to West Coast salmon here. And it's not just the kings anymore, right? It's across the board. The silvers are shut down almost everywhere they can be fished for right now. Even the pinks. I mean, even the pinks hit the news today for being an incredibly weak run, and that's borne out across rivers across what is referred to as the Great Land. So, Eva, thank you so much for coming. When you guys have those websites and materials available, I would love to include them in the show notes here so that people can click through and get more information. So, certainly keep in touch on that front. So thank you. Anything you want to add, before we go, anywhere people can reach you if they have more questions, anything of that nature?
Yeah. I think Facebook Messenger is honestly one of the best ways to. That's how we connected.
That is how we connected to you. That's right.
I might have Starlink and I'm out there remote, and honestly, this phone is. I don't always have my phone on, so Messenger is great. And we have a chum salmon bycatch happening, a special meeting in February of 2025. So shout out, people want to join us and learn more about what we're trying to do. That's just part of our solution is at North Pacific. There's a lot of other places where we intend to show up, but meeting people in person and networking with us is like, we need all the support. And I really believe, like you said something too about iconic species. And this is it. Like, remember that, trawling is affecting our iconic species, and the bycatch of those iconic species can't be overlooked. And it isn't just about bycatch of salmon; it's about bycatch of halibut, of red king crab, of other crab. Like, there's a lot of other species that define Alaska that are in peril right now, and we really need to reevaluate what fisheries looks like for our Alaskan communities. We need healthy communities. and healthy fisheries. Like, this is a regenerative economy. We got to work together to take care of it. I really believe that.
Excellent. Eva Burke, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is Salmon Wars.